I did get enough of an idea that he really wanted this just to be a conversation, and for us to somehow kind of open it up in the beginning about topics we'd like to discuss. And first I can just say that my first question to him was, well, should we say next 20 years, and if you're talking about in translation, what are the priorities in translation? Maybe we should, if we take today's discussion and say translation as a part of transmission or an aspect of transmission, we could just very broadly talk about what aspects of transmission do you think are a priority for the next 20 years, is the question that was what he really had in mind. Because at first I had taken him to be talking about, like, what translations do you want to see done, of what texts and this sort of thing. And he said, no, it's much bigger than that. It's not about text, and people can suggest things like that if they want, but it's a bigger sort of reflective of looking at the place that the West is, or the place where we are now, and just sort of brainstorming together and getting ideas out about this transmission, what we really think needs to happen. And just as a total this is the exception to prove the rule. It was a totally random thing. We've had these wonderful talks from translation theorists and translators who are not in our immediate language area, and it's been immensely helpful for us. I said, just randomly, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had some poet come and speak to us about language and teach us more about poetry? Now, this is just because I want to learn about poetry. I want to become a better poet, or better with words and think in a better way. I've looked at Alamkara Shastra and these other things where it's described in very traditional terms, but my own language, I don't know a thing about poetry, except what I was taught in school, which we all know is pretty limited. But really, it's an open field here, and we wanted to bring this discussion up and have it be reflective and try and get some of these things down. And I don't know what Marcus is intending to do with the information exactly. I mean, he's certainly a planner, and you see he's put this whole conference together, so these ideas will be heard and understood. But it's a conversation. It's not a presentation from our side here. And Holly has gracefully stepped in, and she's going to help us with this, and we're going to try and engage and have the conversation and mediate this.
May I add something?
Please.
Yeah. So I guess one question, just to sort of narrow the focus, I mean, we could go the direction of what skill sets actually do we think translators need in order to be effective over the generations, whether it's transmitting what the early generation of translators from Tibetan into English have gleaned and how those could be passed forward, or do we want to go another direction, and maybe we want to do both, which is what are the conditions of reception? And I feel like we haven't talked about that at all in this conference, except a little bit today, thinking about ritual context, but what are the actual conditions of reception for all these texts that are being translated? Some of them are used in the classroom. Some liturgical materials are being used by Dharma groups. But who are the readers that we could be cultivating? Not just presuming are out there to buy the books, but what do we need to, what kind of context do we need to cultivate for people to be readers of these texts? And that's sort of taking it from the other side. Because I think there's something about transmission that has to do with a conduit. And it's very, very difficult to get a noise-free conduit, right? Conduit's part of the problem of transmission, just of, let's say, electricity or communication across a telephone wire or communication on the internet, is that there's a lot of noise. And I think somebody mentioned, actually, Karma Lecce Tsomo had this beautiful way of putting it, that we are trying to transmit ancient texts in an age of digital distraction. And that's the noise, just to get, like we were talking about, undergrads to put away their cell phones for your class for an hour and 15 minutes and be undistracted and pay attention and maybe even do the reading. That's so. This is part of it. Is who are the readers of this text, and how do we create context for the reception? So, I think we can do that and other things. So, are there other aspects of translation, transmission that we want to
and maybe
discuss?
Just as a method here, let's try to get a few things out, and then let's hone in on the ones we actually want to talk about. So there could be some sort of suggestions, and we'll write them up. Thank you. And then just try and, narrow in on what might be the important points to focus on. So if you have any thoughts.
Do resources for translators?
Anything. Yes,
Yes.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't even know whether this exists or not. But is there a digital version of the Nagy dictionary that's fully searchable?
Not
Yes.
No.
that's fully searchable.
Yes.
Fully searchable.
Headward or fully?
Searchable.
Both in Sanskrit? Oh, really?
Where?
Can I have it? Okay.
That's not what
No.
Yes. No. The Russians just did it,
Oh, really?
and it's out. It is out there. So
We were-
one less thing for you to do.
I told Kurt the other night, please do this, and so now it's done.
If there's one thing that I wish that I had in terms of lexicographical resources, it's that.
So, but anyway, a broader category. We're staying broad here. The lexicographical
We could
resources
say
and other sort of
electronic.
resources.
I would throw out, and I said, I'm not sure how to phrase it, so just in general, I would say language training for translators. And by what I mean by that is, at one point when I was contemplating going into Tibetan studies, I was somewhat terrified because I hadn't done language work in a while. And so I just took a summer off and I decided to learn Latin. And one of the books that was required for the class was this slim little volume that I've left on my shelf ever since, and it was called English Grammar for Students of Latin. And I think what we need is English grammar for students of Tibetan. And I always said that, I've seen so many students who've learned Tibetan, and almost at the cost of being able to learn proper English.
Okay. So the language training for translators is the broader category, but a specific example.
It's almost to sort of reinforce the literary dimensions of one's own language that I think are too easily forgotten when you're paying so much deference
Hmm.
to. So I don't know how one would instantiate such a thing, but it's
Okay.
throwing out random desiderata.
Yeah. Please. Any more? Thank you.
I was getting this
Reception.
almost reception. And, being in the Bay Area and going to many Dharma centers there, it's a little bit like visiting the Vedanta Society when I was a teenager. That is, you may think you walked into a nursing home by accident. And we have a very aging Tibetan Buddhist population in my neck of the woods. I'm interested. And I feel like we're in a little bubble here. How we really ramp up production, but the reception, I would be pleased to know that it's there, or there clearly some of the younger lamas are gathering groups around them. Seton was very, very successful.
So priority is young people.
Well, reach, what is it going to take? What is it going to take to reach young people would be one thing, or alternatively, there's a traditional notion that this interest in Buddhism in the 60s and 70s was just a total anomaly. Young people was anomalies. Many of my Tibetan teach that this is something you do when you're a layperson does when they're 60,
Right.
Not something when they're 20.
Right.
So that would be another thing, is that we're, this population that's looking at their cell phones all the time will have to age.
Right.
And then they'll use. So.
Okay.
it seems like we
I think it's very valid. Thank you.
That's right. We were going to sell the books, all the translations too.
That assumes that anybody reads these things, which,
It's a good point.
what Sarah was saying today, it kind of implied that, in fact, very few people actually read the things that we do.
Do you think they're just gathering them on their shelf in reverence, or that the sales are somehow low? I mean, is that?
The sales are low.
Maybe a little both.
We had, the original Tsadra conferences were just the fellows that were, doing translation work. It was a small, maybe 20, 25 people. I think the second one that I went to, Sydney and Jeff Cox came to sort of inform us on, what was going from the publishing end. I never forget, they said basically that translations, what we were doing, said no interest at all. He said that the books that were of interest were the books that were being written that were more popular kind of, spiritual self-help kind of things. I just remember that, and our group was just kind of this dead silence at that moment. But I'm interested in what you might have to say from, and Greg also, from, the colleges and universities. What kind of people are, coming to your classes? Are they just randomly, like somebody mentioned, filling, and you did, filling general requirements for their degree, or are there people who see what you do as, something that is, liberal, in a liberal arts sense, sort of, meaningful? And, because I think it's very different from what's going on. It still goes on in Dharma centers. As Kurt says, mostly a little bit.
We actually do read translations in the classroom, so that is like one place where
Yeah.
translations are really valued and dug into and contextualized, and they write papers and they
That's
really
good to
study
hear.
them. Yeah, but I think you're pointing to two things. One is that how do we cultivate actually a broader readership? How do we make what we do accessible without kind of going the route of oversimplifying and
Right.
decontextualizing, which seems really kind of dangerous?
I'd like to add to, I don't know which category, but community building. Or, I work with Marcus, and at least these two conferences so far, the main purpose was to bring a community together. And in terms of cultivating readership, it feels like I've been exposed to so many more young people that I didn't even know were around in this context right here. And it doesn't have to just be conferences, but like, online tools, collaboration, community collaboration tools and things like that. Like, I think that has a lot of power to have young people see all the books that are laying down there in one place and see the richness of what's been done.
Community outreach.
Community.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a
Community
generic
building.
term, but
Community building, yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
Otherwise, missionary activity.
Missionary. Actually, this is an interesting question. Funny enough, I don't know how long. Maybe now it's 13 years ago. I taught a class, and Marcus was in the class. And I was going to tell this story today because I know it was a class on the 20 types of Sangha in the Abhisamayalankara, right? So really thrilling material. It's really interesting, but okay. I liked it, right? And at the end of the class, we were talking about Sangha in general and how the term is used in the English language and this sort of stuff. And Marcus was talking about Sangha of the academic community. And I said, I don't think that's really what Sangha meant in those days, And he was really upset that I or it seemed like we had this sort of challenge thing about what is the real purpose of community and how does that function? And I think that obviously it's a big word, Sangha, and you brought up, or not you brought it up, but who brought up today about the Gendun, the difference of that and specifying even, all right, Ringuntu, so specifying even more but anyway, this issue of community I think is a bigger question. But yes, how do you convert would be one thing. But I think a lot of people are not just looking for the conversions. They want friends. They want some sort of life.
I want to give other people a chance to speak, but just on this very point, Art and I were talking during the lunch. This isn't only a problem about, kind of geriatric sanghas in the United States, but even in Tibetan culture. Monasteries aren't being populated anymore by young Tibetans. And
They're not being populated by young Tibetans from exile. The vast majority of new attendees to the monasteries are actually coming out of Tibet.
Right.
well, that's actually not true.
Not
anymore.
Okay,
not
maybe,
India.
well,
They're not able to come.
5-10 years ago it was.
And
There was a lot of border
even in Tibet,
regions.
even in Tibet, monastic vocations in general are down.
This I think is also,
Nuns are so important, actually, because
Sorry?
there's this is where the nuns are so important.
Yeah.
I mean, I really appreciate Carmelita Somo saying, you know, oh, we need an army to do this. And look at all these women who've been dying to jump in, and now they can be harnessed. And I think nuns in lots of Buddhist communities have come back to life or come to life in modernity because of some closer connection to the laity. In some places, they're more engaged in development
That's a
work.
really good point.
And so, yeah, so there's maybe this is like a real shift in what we understand as Sangha.
do we want to keep going on this? Let's get a few more ideas out, because then we can choose where to put our time.
The idea of relevance to the readership is like, I don't know how we cultivate that, but.
Figuring out issues of relevance.
That's really great.
That's what I was just going to comment on, is I can remember being a grad student and having practitioners from Dharma centers come up and basically say, can you recommend a good book on Tibetan Buddhism? And they would say, I want to practice Buddhism, can you recommend a good book? And they'd say, and don't tell me meditation on emptiness. Right? You know, because, and I think there's this disconnect between, you know, yeah, the 20 Sangha is a fantastic subject, right? But it's not what somebody walks into
No,
a Dharma center is
no,
looking for.
I was just
Right.
making up for it.
Yeah.
But that's
Yeah.
my point, is when we talk about cultivating a readership,
That's what
Yeah.
right? I mean, it's like, you kind of have to know what you want to know.
Right.
And I think there's that, I mean, certainly when I got into it, it's like I didn't know what I should know. So I think it's more than cultivating readership.
And this actually gets back to the second part of your question, Art, about undergraduates. I mean, the undergraduates that show up in my class, I mean, we used to have distribution requirements, and a lot of the religious studies courses were in there, but the Buddhism courses never were, because they filled anyway. And they're still filling as the humanities, you know, is having trouble. Part of it is I teach in Boulder, Colorado, and Buddhism is in the air, and they're curious. But they're curious actually to take it as an elective. They're curious for themselves. Now that puts a university professor in an awkward position at a public institution, right? So you know, because we're not allowed to convert or preach, or you know, and not that I would want to, but they all do have this personal interest. So you know, navigating that. And what is the disconnect between the young people who actually are showing up and interested in a college classroom and other forums like Dharma centers or other kinds of communities that they might be a part of? So I think there's something there too, that the interest might be there, but there might not be, you know, the kind of, maybe this is where the mindfulness movement is doing it right, a secular space for them to engage. You had your hand up before.
Yeah, I'm neither a translator nor an academic or a practitioner, and I'm tremendously impressed and encouraged by what's happening in the academy and what the translative community is doing and producing. But when I look at this issue on the transmission side, the thing that worries me the most is the transmitters and which Westerners are going to be able to bring the presence and ability to transmitting these teachings in an authentic and powerful way. And what tools do they need to be able to do it? For example, one of my teachers has said that rather than doing the traditional abhishekas that the Tibetans have provided us with, maybe we need to go back to the Indian sources of the abhisheka and look at the more informal ways that they conducted the transmission. And maybe coming back to that, we'll get out of this cultural bind that we're currently in and find more simple ways of communicating the essence of the core transmission. So those are the things that strike me as critical path forward for the next 20 years. How to find ways for Westerners to be able to transmit Dharma. And those people also should be the consumers for your translations.
This is like
There we go.
Yeah. So that's important. That actually starts to connect the translations who are using them. And wasn't it Sarah who said actually these may be for the teachers or the transmitters, and then maybe those are the people who could start to cultivate a readership, help their relevance, and generate sales. Yeah, Amanda.
Just wanted to echo that. I think it's important to see a kind of awareness and practice and awareness of the fact that this transmission is very much in the becoming, to step back if we can and take a long view of it and think about what this period will look like when people 50 years, 100 years from now look back, whether they'll say, look at that slavish conservatism to this kind of deification of foreign models. Look at this insecurity of forging their own way. Is that what they'll say? Some might not. Some will say, oh, look, there's the seeds of a real American Buddhism. And I think just an awareness that this is happening and this is the place where we are now is something that probably would inform how we see transmission, maybe less so how we translate.
But can you put that into a priority? Like, what would you say the priority is? Yeah, well, I mean, if you're stating it positively as what is the priority for the next 20 years, as you would state that.
We'll look back at and be proud of.
The priority is to cultivate.
It might be simply to have this kind of long-term view.
To develop a longer term.
That bird's eye view that doesn't focus too much on the present, but thinks about this within the context of broader history and historical developments.
Historical
Long
and
view self-awareness, maybe.
long view self-awareness. Anybody else? Thank you. Thank you. In the back?
I guess we'll reiterate your point, because you're a point of practitioner as well, and evolution of humanity has changed. It's changing very rapidly. We're talking about millennials. I mean, the millennials, the education system for them is antiquated compared to our corporations are antiquated. So what the new evolution of humanity has gotten into this particular point. So they're actually looking for thoughts. Thoughts usually come from whatever. If you take them into a rigorous academic discipline, like what today's university, it's not going to really accompany their particular evolution. I mean, the evolution is really getting into the light body, which is really being on the presence and receiving information through particular means which the Buddhism we're trying to actually inculcate 1,000 years ago. So that evolution, actually after 1,000 years, coming back into something different evolution of humanity. But they were actually well evolved at that point. It's happened that we kind of became too academic.
Can I ask you, so are you saying that really has to do with how the content of these texts or the translation of these texts or even the content of the Dharma is actually communicated, that they have a totally different communication style, so that the translation downstairs of Shatkar's song that might speak to them most is the emoji translation? Like, are we having a paradigm shift in kind of with millennials and communication? I mean, I sometimes think about that in the classroom.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure amongst the teachers and translators here, I mean, looking at the humanities, in general, the humanities are dying on the vine in a large way. And I mean, I'm not pronouncing them dead, but there's a very difficult time. And so that's one area where I really see this. You have to justify scientifically why the humanities are valuable, and then you have to be able to quantify it. And this has been happening in all the areas, anthropology, sociology, whatever you want to say. is moving towards quantitative analyses, demonstrable benefits, and this sort of thing, which is never the area that humanities was born in, at least not in the observable way. So I've seen it there personally, but also studying these very sort of lofty texts. And you have to be so committed to this notion of an education. There's an entire notion of an education when you study these texts. I don't read this text like I've got to know what it's going to mean to my life today. I believe that it's important for me to study these texts and to get a classic education. I want to know the classics. I have that wish to know the canon. I have a belief in something that is to be had from that kind of education. And you will never stop me because that's deep in my person. But this wish to know the canon, or the respect for a canon, is something that this is being really questioned throughout humanities in general. I mean, the canon, of course, excluded women, it excluded homosexuals. I mean, so there's problems with the canon, and we had to re-question that. But there's a big problem. The diversity issue is making this idea of a canon less tenable, for one thing. And then also the notion of that ambition of a student to kind of know this information for the sake of knowing it doesn't seem to be there so much in what I'm seeing. But when I'm translating these texts, I know that's the universe that they existed in. These were textbooks for a very different universe. So if I'm trying to sell them on the open market, it's like you're going to sell a textbook on the open market. These aren't novels. These aren't going to interest people. These aren't relevant in the sort of grab you by the socks and make you go, oh, this is great. But that interest is not there. And I'm not saying, oh, terrible thing, forget it, we've lost. But it's something that I personally have noticed in terms of my own work, is I see there is very little audience for this, not because the lack of people, but the lack of that kind of interest in the canons, or in the sort of bigger thing. So,
well, I mean, putting this in the context of the sort of decline of the humanities, I think is really relevant, because in some ways, I think the reason why the Academy has actually, we retreat into our private conversations, and we've lost a sense of the public intellectual, and I think that's really affected our politics, today. And so, in some sense, maybe we need somebody, like we talk about how the popular self-help stuff, sells like hotcakes, and then the translations are sort of sitting reverentially on somebody's shelves, and maybe they pick it up every once in a while to read a verse for inspiration. But where are the middle texts, the really interesting, informed, intellectual conversations that are talking about why the history of Tibet, should be relevant to practitioners and not suspect, not seen as undermining, their, epistemological commitments to what their sort of worldview that the Lama has shared with them. Where's the high-level conversation in a way that I think this conference is trying to create by bringing together scholars and translators and practitioners. There's really no media space for that. Even the journals like Buddha Dharma that purport to be sort of, high-level conversations are still the same, like, how do you meditate, beginning level, because they want to capture this big audience. And then the scholarly journals are kind of really hard for anybody to access if you don't have access to a university library. I mean, with certain online publication exception. So, in a way, there needs to be a more kind of informed body of
a curriculum, perhaps?
Well, not even a curriculum. I mean, there could be like translators teaching the text they translated to practitioners, but there could also be books that are crossing in this middle space.
Well, this is when you mention this, what I think of is what Wisdom attempted 20, 30 years ago, when they had their orange series and their the white series and the different levels of gradations of okay, you're just new to the thing, read all the orange books. You've learned something, okay, good. Then you can move on to the white books.
Right.
I feel like this whole conversation, though, is missing the following. So, I mean, from the humanities situation is a symptom, not isolated.
We're talking about social,
So
commentary as much as we are about
Mhm.
the subject.
Well, so give me 1 minute. So I think we all thought it was a great idea to flatten the earth, and we didn't realize that when we did that, economics tells us that our style of living will naturally go to the average. And so what I've seen in the student body over the 20 years that I've been teaching is that we've transitioned from education to vocational training, not because people have lost any, neurons or broader vision or soul or something, but because they're much more desperately worried about surviving than I was when I was in school. And so that's the starting point.
But why is that?
Because it's tough to get a job. I mean, unemployment in Europe and places is, among the young, is 25%.
I don't think so. I think when we were younger, the unemployment rate was probably as high as it is now.
But
I think there's
student loans.
something that's different now, that somehow we didn't
Well,
care.
I'm happy to talk. I just felt like, I've talked about this with friends and as well as young people. I don't know about you, but I thought, what's the worst thing that could possibly happen? I'll be a manager at Burger King, but I'll have something. It never occurred to me that I might actually worry about where my next paycheck was going.
Yeah.
It just was unthinkable. Every student that I talk to feels pressure that they will ever have a sustained employment.
So where does that come from?
Well, the global economic crisis, maybe the parents